My main reason for that is you're going to end up with a really heavy arrow to achieve like 15%, which to me is like the dream.
Guys, welcome to the ElkShape YouTube channel. We are again at Spokane Valley Archery, keeping safe social distancing. This is my man, Josh Jones. If you guys didn't know, he's kind of been my archery coach. I met him 20 years ago. This is where I've been coming for all my bow stuff for the last 2 decades. So Josh, thanks for coming on. So we want to talk about what the FOC, what the front of center. Everybody's always geeking out, almost bragging about how heavy their arrow is nowadays. I used to be kind of a heavy arrow connoisseur, but relatively speaking, even my heaviest arrow days are nowhere near what some of these guys are taking hunting nowadays. Yeah. And since I've met you, I've actually reeled it back quite a bit. And my arrow weight, total setup, is 454 grains. And I'm cool with that because my Matthews is not the world's fastest bow, but is the most accurate bow that I've shot. So can we talk about arrow weights today? Can we talk about front of center to kind of dispel some of those myths out there?
Well, front of center, or FOC, or FOC, is the percentage of weight that is in the front portion of your arrow in relation to the back portion of your arrow. And all that means, when you try to balance your arrow out, it's how much of the front arrow sits level from the back. This is an example of not a lot of FOC or forward to center percentage. It's the percentage of arrow in front of the middle on your balance point. FOC is important within reason. So what a lot of people are using is excessively high amounts, and that's all fine and dandy, but remember there's a lot that goes into making forward to center percentage in an arrow. It's not just how much weight you put in the front of your arrow, which is what most people are overlooking. First of all, as you add weight to the front of your arrow, you need to stiffen your arrow to achieve the same spine or the same amount of force that it takes to flex this. You make this heavier, this thing bends a lot easier, so it gives more, so this guy needs to be stiffer. You then end up with a heavier arrow back here, which decreases your forward to center percentage. So my personal opinion is to try to stay on a little bit lighter grain per inch shaft. In my world, in my preference, this is Dan's arrow. This is an Axis 340 spine. This is the heaviest grain per inch arrow I would ever use personally. That's not to discourage people from using full metal jackets or anything that's excessively heavy. I know Victory makes a extortion that's really heavy GPI. My main reason for that is you're going to end up with a really heavy arrow to achieve like 15%, which to me is like the dream. If you can get 15% FOC in a hunting configuration, you're doing really good. Now, if you go heavy, you are also choosing to go very slow. And I understand that you want to hit anywhere on that animal and penetrate and go through. I totally get that. But what good is all that energy and all that penetration if that animal took a step and a half before your arrow got there because your arrow's going so slow that it takes forever to get there? You have to think of every particular thing in the realm of what's going on and what you're accomplishing. So by taking a slightly grain per inch lighter shaft and increasing the spine, like I think Dan used to shoot 400s before he started putting a lot of weight in the front to achieve a similar spine. He's now got a brass in here. He's a 50 or 75. So there's a 75 grain brass in here on a 340 spine arrow with 3 veins in the back and a 100 grain tip, and he's achieving about 15%.
Yep.
Somewhere around there. And part of what's helping him achieve that 15% with this heavier GPI arrow is the fact that they're so short. Every inch you can cut off your arrow is roughly 0.5 to 0.75% better FOC. You're also making a stiffer arrow. So if you ever look at any of our more detailed configurations that we build, you're going to frequently see the arrow being cut as short as possible within, 1/2 inch in front of the launcher, which some people would disagree with that method. And I understand everyone has their own view of what they think is right and what they think is wrong. But to me, everything we're using has a containment rest of some sort. It's not unsafe at any point to cut your arrow back as long as it's in front of the launcher. And by making that arrow shorter, you achieve making that arrow stiffer and you increased its FOC. So you can take, your average configuration. What's your 27 draw?
27 draw.
Okay, so if you cut your arrow at 27 inches or 27.5 inches, which in conventional thinking is typically what you would set it at, take that exact same arrow, cut it down 1.5 inches to where it's in front of the launcher. You have now taken the same arrow that you have and allowed yourself to put 75 grains in the front. Because you've made the arrow so much stiffer by shortening it, you can increase that FOC and increase that downrange energy and not have to buy another arrow. So if you're using an arrow setup that's out in front of your riser by a measurable amount, 1/2 inch, 1 inch, you should be able to cut it down still clear, assuming you're using an arrow rest that sits behind your riser, and not have to buy new arrows. If you're not, if your arrows are already cut down and you want to put a 50 grain or 75 grain or 100 grain heavier insert in your arrow, guess what? You need a new arrow. You can't just throw that on there and hope it's going to work. It's not gonna. So there's a couple of things that detract from improving your FOC in the front. And there's a reason why I don't shoot 4-fletch arrows, or I don't shoot wraps, or I don't do anything to add weight to the back end of the arrow. Because every 5 grains you put back here, you need 25 grains up here roughly to achieve the same FOC percentage. So by taking one of these veins that weighs 7 or 8 grains and adding another one back here, you now need like 30 or 40 grains up here to achieve the same percentage. And then you've added 30 or 4 grains to the front. So now you need a stiffer arrow. Adding weight back here is about the worst thing you can do for FOC, to increase your FOC. It causes you or forces you to change everything else along the way. So you want to add weight up here, but you have to do it accordingly. If you have an already built setup that works really well and you don't want to change the arrow length and you want to put that weight up in the front, you need to go up 50 to 100 deflection points. So if your arrow is a 400 spine, you need a 350, 340, 300, depending on what brand of arrow you're using, to achieve the same flex in the arrow. So it still tunes, but gives you that great FOC. But at the end of the day, I really personally recommend the lightest grain per inch shaft within reason, nothing that's really fragile or brittle, but the lightest grain per inch shaft that you can get that's still really durable, as stiff as you can manage, and just keep adding weight to the front. So personally, I shoot a Victory arrow, and that actual arrow right here is an RIP TKO with a steel insert. I think this is about 14% because my arrows are a little longer than Dan's. But I'm still only running like 420, 430 overall weight. So it's still relatively light, still relatively fast. So I'm not giving up velocity, but still maintaining energy. And yes, a heavier arrow is probably going to penetrate better, but we're talking very small percentages here for how much velocity you're giving up. And at the end of the day, I chalked up every hunting instance I've had in my life to what went wrong. Because let's be honest, we're all going to fail. We're all going to screw up. We're all going to make mistakes. That's just part of the whole experience of hunting. And the majority of my errors had been because the animal moved after I shot. Like everything was right. I had the distance, I had the wind right, I made a good clean shot, but that animal took a step and a half before my arrow got there. And the slower my arrow is leaving my bow, the more time that animal has to move. So that shot that was 6 inches off, if I was shooting a 600 grain arrow, it would have been 9 inches or 10 inches off. So now I've missed the lungs completely and I'm back in the guts or front of the shoulder, that sort of thing. In that scenario, everything else being equal. So don't just go super duper heavy without at least paying attention to what your velocity is, because your velocity matters at the end of the day. It's really important. In my personal opinion, in building the perfect arrow, 15% is ideal. Anytime over 15% forward to center, you are really diminishing the velocity. It's very hard to achieve a 17%, 18%, 19% FOC setup without ending up with like a 600, 700 grain arrow. It's damn near impossible until they make GPI arrows that are, 250 spine that weigh 6 grains an inch. You're not going to do it without ending up with a super heavy arrow. I find 15% is achievable in most brands, in most types, unless you have a really long draw length. If you have like a 31 or 32 inch draw length, you're probably not going to be able to achieve that without being 600, 650 grains on your arrow weight. I like to run about 15%. I've ran as low as 13% and it still seems to shoot okay. But anything at 13 to 15% in that vicinity, I can't see a better group when I start exceeding past that. But I definitely see a lot of drop when I exceed past that. So to me, 15% is the number I would target.
Yeah, so best practices, summarizing, and it's funny because it's what you kind of had me evolved is I no longer put wraps on the back of my arrows. I use max stealths now, and I would clock, and we go based on that orientation out the bow, and it's left. And what else? I do put weight up front. I went from FMJs to Axis. That's your fault. But at the end of the day, who wants to shoot a Lincoln log when it screams duck or move, and then your one shot opportunity is squandered? So just going over best practices.
And it's not just that, because in that FMJ that we're using, and why we talked you out of it and got you going to something different, is because we shed 30 grains off of your arrow. Your FOC went up a point and a half without changing anything else. So everything else being equal, same spine, same tip weight, same brass insert, same amount of fletch back here, we still went up like a point and a half just by going to a different arrow with the same stiffness. Remember, heavier isn't stronger, because they have a given amount of flex, regardless of whether it's a very light stiff material or a heavy stiff material. They still have the same amount of flex. So you're not getting a stiffer projectile when you're going to something heavier. You're just getting a heavier projectile. That doesn't necessarily make it more accurate. It doesn't necessarily make it penetrate more. So
pay attention to what's on the back end, what's on the front end. Cut as short as possible. This is everything we talk about today is basically with elk in mind. This is ElkShape. And so we want you guys to have the best success. That's why we bring these guys in to kind of talk through it. The last thing we're going to do on this FOC video to do it right is we've got to talk Outserts. So for a season, tried a brand that makes Outserts, and I lost all of them in all the targets. I would sand, I would use different epoxies, 24-hour epoxies. They would dent, I hated them. And so they don't work for me, but there's so many of you that message us that you got these collars, these Outserts. So Josh is the guy. Can you talk about, maybe some of the best products out there for guys that are interested in Outserts or collars?
if you're trying to use sleeves, you got to pay attention to the ID and the OD of your shaft, or the inside diameter and the outside diameter of your shaft compared to what you're trying to put on it. In most instances, it's usually not a big deal. They usually stay in there pretty good. If they're not steel, they're probably going to bend depending on how long your adapter is. A standard 204 size shaft usually doesn't have much of an adapter, so it's only sticking out, a 1/4 inch longer, maybe 3/8 of an inch longer. That's not very likely to bend. We're talking about like a 166 size shaft, so a small diameter, 1464s, VAP, deep 6 injection. There's a whole bunch of them. Black Eagle makes them, Carbon Express makes them, Gold Tip makes them. They all make a small diameter arrow. Those get a little more tricky. If you're using steel components, you're going to bend less of them. You're going to lose less of them, but you're still going to lose some. You're still going to bend some, and that is just a byproduct of using that product. You have to be prepared to replace inserts periodically. You have to be prepared to check them and make sure they're still straight, because if that's got a little bit of bend on it and you screw a broadhead in there, it's going to go off by like a foot at 20 yards, 30 yards. It's going to be massively different. So it's really important that if you're using things like that, spin test your arrows. And what I mean by that is put that guy on a counter and spin it. And you can see Dan's, I don't know if it's probably too far out, it doesn't wobble here. If it wobbles here, this guy's bent. Somewhere in here it's bent, or your tip's bent. So if you spin test your arrow and it spins straight, it should fly relatively straight, assuming you don't have any contact issues, assuming you're not hitting something when you're leaving your bow, assuming you're not flinching really bad when you fire it, and assuming that you have the right spine in your bow. If all those things are correct, that should spin straight and fly straight and track where your field point typically would. If it's not, there's things to look at to see what's causing it.
Guys, thanks for watching this video. Make sure to give Spokane Valley a follow on Facebook or Instagram. We'll drop that in the video description. You can also reach Josh at svaorders@gmail.com. If you have any questions or you want to have him do a bow build for you, you can ship your bow in and he'll tune it himself. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.